This function notation word problem is on the second page of your midterm review. Our first step in any word problem is always to read through it carefully. The junior class is holding a walkathon to raise money for prom. The function f of x equals 3x plus 8 plus x plus 4 times x plus 3 represents the total amount of money raised from 4 sponsors. X represents the number of miles walked. One sponsor pledges $3 per mile, a second sponsor pledges a flat $8, and a third sponsor pledges $1 per mile, and the fourth sponsor pledges $4 for each x plus 3 miles walked. So first of all, I'm going to highlight our function. I know it's a very odd-looking function. It has a lot of like terms that we would normally combine if we were working with functions, but let's look at the wording of the problem. One sponsor pledges $3 per mile, a second sponsor pledges a flat $8, a third sponsor pledges $1 per mile, and the fourth sponsor pledges $4 for each x plus 3 miles walked. Now looking at what we highlighted in pink, let's go back and look at this function. We have one term that's 3 times x, we have another that's just 8, we have another that's just x, and then another is 4 times x plus 3. Does that look familiar? Each one of these terms represents the money given by each sponsor, and that's why those terms aren't combined. It's to illustrate the donations given by each individual donor. One other important thing that we need to note, x represents the number of miles walked. So let's take one more look at this. The entire function represents the total amount of money raised from 4 sponsors. The x represents the number of miles walked. Do you see how in the original equation, x is in the parentheses after f? When we're asked to find the value of f of 5, that x is replaced with the number 5. And that is exactly what we're going to do to solve this equation. I'm going to rewrite this equation, and instead of writing x, these are all going to be 5s. And that's it. Now we have 15 plus 8 plus 5 plus 4 times 8, which is 32. And my final answer is 60. F of 5 equals 60. In words, describe what f of 5 means in the context of the problem. Be sure to include your units in your answer. When I asked you this in class, a lot of you would say something like, it represents the total amount of money raised. So, which is not technically wrong, but what they want to know specifically is what f of 5 means. In this problem, the x is 5, and the x, as we know, represents the number of miles walked. So the answer to this problem is going to include what the entire equation represents, what it represents when x is 5, and the answer to the equation f of 5. Part C of this problem might look a little bit complicated, but remember when I said initially that this was an odd way to write an equation? We have a lot of like terms here that would normally be combined. This problem is only asking you to solve for x, which is something that you've done 100 different times. A lot of times you guys are given problems that you would have no issues with if they were just presented as an equation, but as soon as we put words to them, you start to overthink it. We're solving for x. That's it. And in order to solve for x, we have to get x by itself. Before I do anything, though, I have to simplify this equation. And I see I have several terms with x, and I also have a parentheses here that's going to require me to distribute. So I'm going to take care of that first. So when I distribute this 4, this is what I end up with. And now all I have is addition, so I can combine like terms. In this case, our like terms are 3x, x, and 4x, and also 8, and 12. This x value doesn't have a coefficient, but remember when we have a variable with no coefficient in front of it, we know that that coefficient is actually 1. So I'm going to write a 1 because sometimes it makes it easier to add these. So 3x plus 1x plus 4x, that gives me 8x. So now I only have two more like terms, and those are 8 and 12, and I add those and I get 20. So I'm left with 44 equals 8x plus 20. I want to get that x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides, and I get 24 equals 8x. Divide both sides by 8. And x equals 3. Describe in words what your solution to part C represents in the context of the problem. Well, remember, we didn't have x for that problem, and we had to figure it out. But what we did have was f of x. In this case, f of x equaled 44. And in the original problem, we were told that f of x equals the amount of money raised for walking x number of miles. So reading that, we know that this f of x, this 44 must be the number of, so reading that, we know that this 44 must be the amount of money raised for walking x number of miles. Initially, we didn't know what x was. When we did the math, we found that x equals 3. And we'll just read it again. X represents the number of miles walked. For part C, you started with the amount of money you raised and had to figure out how many miles you walked. So let's go back to our original question. We could say that we walked 3 miles to raise $44.